Hello, happy election day. First of all, I just want to begin this week's lecture by saying make sure that you go out and vote. Today is the last day to vote. Make sure that you do that. It's very, very important. I've got my vote t-shirt on. Vote, your voice counts. Be sure to make time today to do that. I know the world is crazy, life is crazy, school is crazy, but make time to do that today. It's very important. Okay, so today I want to talk about syllogisms. This chapter 6 that we are reading right now for this week of your From Critical Thinking to Argument textbook goes over how to construct your own argument and how to evaluate arguments and includes some discussion on syllogisms. But I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper than that because syllogisms can be a little complicated. But a syllogism is a rhetorical device. The way that an author structures their argument is a rhetorical device. And you will be able to better deconstruct an argument that you've read for its sound logic, for its credibility, if you understand how an argument is structured. And of course, then once you look at the flaws in other authors' arguments or the strengths, and once you look at how arguments are structured in a strong way by using these rhetorical devices, you'll be able to structure your own argument, your own very solid argument. Okay? So there's a method, and it's pretty simple, and you probably heard some of these terms already. And I do apologize. Sometimes freshmen, your core classes, your freshman classes, before you get to your classes in your majors, some of it can be a bit of a review. And that's because your instructors, your college professors, don't know how much you covered in high school. And all high schools, their instruction is a little different. So some of this can be a little review. A little bit of a review in your introductory math courses, science courses, history courses, and of course, English courses. So having said that, you may be familiar with some of these terms, but I'm pretty sure that you can gain something new from today's lecture. Okay. So I'm going to go over Toomlin's Elements of Argument to introduce syllogisms to you, or to get into a discussion of syllogisms, what they are, how they work, and how to structure an argument, because that's what our chapter in From Critical Thinking to Argument covers this week. Okay. First, of course, you got the claim, of course, which is the author's stance, what's being argued, an argumentative statement, right? The logical conclusion derived from supporting claims. So you've got a major claim and supporting claims, right? Grounds is, it sounds like we're in a courtroom right now, doesn't it? Grounds are supporting evidence that illustrates specific representative instance that prove a claim true. So grounds is evidence. A warrant is a general broad assumption upon which the claim is based. The conceptual lens through which evidence is read, and it's an implicit value statement. I will post examples of claims and warrants and grounds and go over a few in the lecture today. But I will also post some notes on syllogisms and examples of syllogisms and claims and grounds and warrants on Blackboard today under course materials. Okay, so be looking for that. Again, syllogisms are slightly confusing, how a claim is different from a warrant. So do go and review that after you watch this video, okay? After you watch the lecture today. Backing is the justification or reasoning that reinforces or backs up the warrant. So backing is the logic, grounds is the evidence, and warrant is the assumption. Now, if your audience doesn't grant the assumptions that you're making, they're not going to follow you and you will have an ineffective argument. If one of your assumptions, the argument that you're making, is that freedom is a good thing, and your audience is skeptical of that and doesn't believe that, then your argument's not going to be effective. But that is a warrant, a broad general assumption, a value or belief statement that you assume your audience will also agree with, and you're assuming that they hold the same values and beliefs that are included in that warrant. Okay? Values like freedom or independence. Now, if your audience is suspicious of those values or holds values contrary to the values contained in your warrant, your argument will not be very effective. Okay? Now, it's important when you're doing rhetorical analysis to identify these parts of the argument to be able to perform your analysis and come to a conclusion about how effective the author has made their argument. Okay? Rebuttal is just your comeback, right? It is, and reservation. Rebuttal is your comeback to the opposition, and a reservation or qualifications. A reservation is a qualification, exceptions to the claim, conditional statements, counterexamples, and counterarguments. So all of those are included under rebuttal and reservations. Okay, so I'll stop and pause here just for a minute. When you make a claim, when you make an argument, very rarely can arguments be absolute, always or never. So the reservation or the qualification part of an argument structure is necessary. You've got to qualify the scope of your argument, how far this argument extends, right? Because with almost every argument, you cannot extend it as far as possible. There are qualifications, there are limits, and you need to acknowledge those limits that your argument has by stating specific exceptions to the claim, placing conditional qualifications on that claim. Certain aspects have to be met. Certain conditions have to be met for your claim to be valid, okay? And you need to recognize and state what those are. All right. So again, reservations or qualifications are limitations to the claim, warrant, and backing, and they assert a degree of conditionality. All arguments are conditional depending on the situation. And so you need to specify what that situation is and place those limits, those qualifications upon your argument. All right? So those are the main parts. Once again, claim, grounds, warrant, backing, rebuttal, reservation, and qualification. Okay? And you're familiar with all these parts of an argument. You may not have heard those terms specifically, but this should not be completely new. So don't start to freak out yet. Don't get anxiety yet, okay? Now I want to talk about syllogisms. The Toomlin model here, there are 3 parts to a syllogism, okay? It corresponds directly to the 3 parts of a syllogism. The Toomlin model and the 3 parts of a syllogism correspond. Now, there is a major premise or major claim, which is the warrant and is general, and it's an explanation of how the evidence should be read. There is a minor premise or the grounds, right? Evidence or an example that representatively illustrates the point. And then there's a conclusion or main claim, okay? So we've got major premise, minor premise. Your major premise is the warrant. Your minor premise is the grounds or evidence. And then you've got your conclusion, which is the main claim that you're trying to support. And the logical deduction is that the major premise plus the minor premise equal the conclusion, your main claim, right? The 2 should add up logically, all right? So in the end, you should come to a logical deduction that major plus minor premise equal the conclusion, the claim, the main claim, the point made if the premises are true. It logically follows that the conclusion will also be true. Major premise plus minor premise should add up to the conclusion, which is your main claim, supported by evidence, right? Your minor premise is the evidence. Your major premise is the general warrant or value statement, belief statement, okay? Now, you want to think of every paragraph as a smaller argument and construct each paragraph in this way with its own claim. That you're probably pretty familiar with. So each paragraph should include an explanation of how the evidence is to be read, or your warrant, or your major premise, right? Then it should also include the minor premise, the grounds or the evidence. It should also include finally a conclusion, which is your main claim, right? The major claim, okay? Each paragraph should be structured in that way. So in this way, each paragraph presents and substantiates its own claim. The supporting claims can be added together, having been proven to give rise to the conclusion or the thesis statement or the argument's main claim. If constructed upon sound premises, if both of your major and minor premises are sound, if your warrants and your evidence are sound, then that will equal your main claim, your main thesis. If constructed upon sound premises, warrants that can be backed up, and sound, relevant, and representative evidence, then the thesis should be logically evident to the reader because you've supported it so well with your major and minor premise. Now I want to talk about deductive and inductive arguments. This will also sort of a practical application, help you argue better with loved ones at Thanksgiving or the holidays with either your boyfriend or girlfriend or your parents or friends. This will help you win arguments. So if you learn the parts of an argument here, if you learn to do this well. Okay. There are two types of reasoning, and you have to understand which type of reasoning is better given your subject matter. Sometimes an author will structure their argument using deductive reasoning when giving their subject matter. Inductive reasoning would really serve them better and make a stronger argument. Okay, so deductive argumentation is deductive reasoning, the kind of reasoning wherein the truth of premises, the premises logically guarantees the truth of the output or the conclusion, provided that no mistake has been made in the reasoning. So if major premise is true, minor premise is true, C, your conclusion is also true, like we've just been talking about. However, there's a difference, and there's a specific way in deductive reasoning that you come to your conclusion. And that is, it's the logical process of drawing specific conclusions from general premises. So your warrant or your major premise is broad. It's a general value statement. It is an assumption that you believe your audience will agree with, right? And from there, your minor premise gets more specific and draws upon specific examples. So you're drawing from a general statement to more specific examples. Inductive reasoning works the opposite way. You use a specific example to begin with to draw a larger warrant, to support a larger warrant. You're making a broad claim from a specific example in inductive. Deductive reasoning, you're making a specific claim from a broad example, okay? So again, deduction is the logical process of drawing specific conclusions from general premises. Your warrant is general, it's broad, and the conclusion you come to is specific. Inductive, the conclusion you come to is general and applies in most cases. From a specific example, you're going to broaden that specific example to apply to many more other cases. Deductive reasoning, you're using a case that applies to most, an example that applies to most cases to support that it applies in this one specific instance, okay? Drawing specific conclusions from general premises. And inductive is drawing drawing general conclusions from specific premises, okay? All right. And if that sounds a little confusing, do please go look back at the notes on Blackboard under course materials, and it will be under syllogisms. Okay? Syllogisms and assumptions. But it is important to understand, going back to kind of week 1 of the class, what assumptions the author is making. I will always ask that question after you read something. It's almost always my first or second question. What assumptions is the author making about their audience? And that's what examining syllogisms and examining the structure of the argument will help you to determine. And second only to that is, what values and beliefs does the author hold? And that will appear in their warrant. You can determine what values and beliefs the author holds by really examining the warrant that they make. Okay? Or their major premise. All right? If it's a value or belief that you don't agree with, that they're assuming that you already hold, their argument will not be effective. But always be thinking every time you read an article from our textbook, what assumptions is the author making about their audience? Who is their audience, and what assumptions is the author making about their audience? Sometimes the author can assume that their audience believes that religion is a positive thing. All kinds of different values and beliefs, all different kinds of assumptions about what is good and what the audience believes is good that the author can make of their audience. And there can be a lot of disagreement over these values and beliefs as well. Okay. So deductive argumentation and inductive argumentations. Now I want to speak a little bit about qualifiers and rebuttals. Watch out for overgeneralizations, as I was just talking about a few minutes ago. Meaning, making a claim that is too broad. The broader your claim is, the broader your main argument is, the more evidence you have to be able to cover every single kind of situation that could arise. So you want to be careful about overgeneralizing. Instead, you want to provide the necessary qualifiers and limiters that sort of determine the scope of your argument for your audience. And you'll do that by using qualifiers with the claim and the warrant. Qualifications help ensure that your points are clear and that you only make a claim that the audience allows, or that the evidence allows. You only make a claim that the evidence allows, that you have the evidence to back it up. Again, making a claim that's too broad, you'll have to have much, much more evidence to cover every sort of scenario and every sort of circumstance that could arise. Okay? If necessary, you may also need to include a refutation. You should always look for where the author addresses the opposition, and you should always address the opposition in your own arguments to make your argument stronger. Okay? The opposition may have some good points, so you need to show your audience that you've considered them and been fair to the opposition and have come to the conclusion that you've come to by considering the good arguments that the other side has made, that the opposition has made. Okay? So it may be necessary to include a refutation, a statement that sets up the supporting claim to counter possible rebuttals from your opponents. I would say, maybe possible, I would say really always do this. It's a very good rhetorical move to anticipate what the opposition has to say. It really proves to your audience that you've considered the issue from all angles before coming to a decision, before forming an opinion, before coming to a conclusion. Okay? So you want to include your rebuttal that addresses and deals with the arguments, with the opposition's argument. And there are several ways to do this that we'll go into later on in the semester. Okay, several ways to address the opposition. But you may need to add a rebuttal statement to set up your supporting claim or counter possible rebuttals from your opponents. It can be a single statement in a paragraph or a whole paragraph of its own, depending on how much, depending on how much space in your essay it takes to adequately address the opposition's point. Okay. Now, of course, the focus should be on your own points that you're making and less on the opposition, but you have to at least acknowledge and address the opposition to show that you are a credible researcher, that you've looked at the issue from each side and are logical and reasonable and rational. Okay? Often refutation claims start with a transitional phrase or clause that sets up a juxtaposition. While expert so-and-so claims that XYZ is the case, new evidence suggests that the contrary is more valid. And that's one way to address the opposition. There are several different kind of ways to do it, and I will give you formulas on how to do that, because it's not easy, right, to address the opposition fairly without seeming biased, and to address the opposition without weakening your own case. If it's done correctly, it should really strengthen your case, your argument. Above all, what matters in argumentation is that you do not say anything that you cannot back up, that you don't have evidence for, which you all know that. Okay, syllogisms. Now let's look at syllogisms. They're set up, major plus minor premise equals conclusion, and your conclusion is your main argument, right? So I'm going to give you some examples of syllogisms, simple syllogisms. They get more complicated, but this will get the point across, okay? So they're easily understandable. I myself sometimes have trouble identifying the three parts of syllogisms, something you'll have to continue to practice with throughout your educational career, but will really serve you outside of school, in your career, and in life very well, as part of critical thinking, and as part of explaining your own thoughts and ideas and viewpoints, okay, in a logical, well-structured way that is effective and will persuade your audience. So, as we know, syllogisms. Forgive me, I skipped a slide. I'm reading from my notes and I skipped a slide. Okay, syllogisms. I was about to skip over the definition. That's important, right? A syllogism is a deductive form of reasoning. Again, that means that your warrant, your major premise, is broad and your conclusion is specific, as opposed to inductive reasoning, where your premise is specific and your conclusion is broad, right? Taking one instance and applying it to all instances, or taking all instances and applying it to one specific instance, all right? Deductive means that you get more specific. Inductive means that you get more general. Okay. So a syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning. We're going to start with a broad major premise. Your major premise is broad, and it's a value statement. It's broad, and our conclusion we come to is going to be specific. All right? But A plus B should equal C when you're done setting up your syllogism. Okay. Deductive reasoning, where you arrive at a specific conclusion by examining two premises or ideas. Syllogism derives from the Greek word syllogismos, meaning conclusion or inference. Okay. Some syllogisms, the majority, the general basic syllogism contains three parts: major premise, minor premise, and your conclusion. Your conclusion is your main argument. For example, all roses are flowers. That is a general claim, and it is your major premise. From there, we're going to get more specific. Here's your minor premise, which is evidence. This is a rose. All roses are flowers. This is a rose. Minor premise, evidence, or grounds, right? Lastly, your conclusion, your main claim. Therefore, I am holding a flower. All roses are flowers. This is a rose. Therefore, I'm holding a flower. Is the conclusion that you come to, okay? Your major premise is broad. And it is an assumption that you make. And your minor premise is evidence that backs up that assumption or value statement, okay? And the conclusion you come to is arrived at by adding your major and minor premise together. Excuse me. Allergies are bothering me this morning. Okay. Syllogisms. All right, so I want to go over a few different types of syllogisms, okay? One is a categorical syllogism. So our first example was about roses. If A is part of C, then B is part of C. That's one strain of logic that categorical syllogisms rely upon. All right, here's some more examples of categorical syllogisms. And just like the name says, you're using a major and minor premises to categorize something, an idea, an object, anything. A categorical syllogism uses major and minor premises to categorize, to place something in a category in your conclusion, in your main argument claim, okay? And we've read some articles in our textbook that do that. They argue for placing some pop culture artifact in a certain category, right? Okay. All cars have wheels. I drive a car, therefore my car has wheels. It's a silly, simple syllogism, but you understand how it's using the major and minor premise to categorize cars. Your own car specifically, right? All insects frighten me. That is an insect. Therefore, I am frightened. Major premise. All insects frighten me. Minor premise. That is an insect. Minor premise is your grounds, your evidence, and your major premise is your warrant or your general broad value statement, right? Conclusion, I am frightened. Okay, so there's a couple examples of categorical syllogisms. Conditional syllogisms. If A is true, and then B is true. That is a conditional syllogism. Now, for a conditional syllogism, you don't need both the major and minor premise, all right? They're often referred to as hypothetical syllogisms because their arguments aren't always valid because they don't have both. They don't have the minor premise, which is the grounds, that is the evidence, okay? So here's an example. If Katie is smart, you could see why if you're doing rhetorical analysis, you might kind of attack the use of a conditional syllogism because it's weaker than other types of syllogisms, in the fact that it doesn't include the minor premise, the evidence, the grounds, okay? If Katie is smart, then her parents must be smart. So the major premise is Katie is smart, and the conclusion is Katie's parents are smart. If A is true, then B is true. And we often believe that we get our intelligence from our parents, and so that is an assumption that if your audience didn't believe that that was true, if your audience was a psychologist who understood that we get our intelligence not just from our parents but from other places, they might not grant that major premise or warrant because they don't believe that intelligence comes from the parents, or they understand that very little of it relies upon the parents and more of it relies on socioeconomic factors, whatever else, what other factors go into what we call intelligence, what we define as intelligence, okay? If Richard likes Germany, then he must drive an Audi. Richard likes Germany. He must like all things German, including their cars. Okay? Kind of silly there. So that's conditional. And you can see how certain conditions have to be met for that syllogism to be proven true. Disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogisms follow since A is true, B must be false. So it's almost exactly like the conditional syllogism, except that we're talking about falseness now, false claims now. Disjunctive syllogisms fall since A is true, B must be false. They don't state if a major or minor premise is correct, but it's understood and implied that one of them is correct. So an example would be major premise, this cake is either red velvet or chocolate. Minor premise, evidence, grounds, it is not chocolate. Conclusion, it must be red velvet. Major premise, on the TV show Outlander, Claire's husband is either dead or alive. He's not alive. Minor premise, evidence, grounds. So, conclusion, we come to main claim, Claire's husband is dead. Okay? Enthymemes. So those are the three most commonly used types of syllogisms in argumentation. An enthymeme is not one of the major types of syllogisms, but is super common. It's what's known as a rhetorical syllogism, and since this is rhetoric, we're going to be really interested in what an enthymeme is. These are often used in persuasive speeches and arguments. An argumentative statement, an enthymeme is an argumentative statement in which the writer or speaker omits one of the major or minor premises, does not clearly pronounce it, but implies it. This is called an enthymeme. However, the omitted premise in an enthymeme remains understandable even if it's not clearly, overtly expressed, explicitly expressed. For instance, where there is smoke, there is fire. The hidden premise is, the minor premise is, fire causes smoke. Now, if you didn't agree with that, or if it couldn't be proven true, it's unstated because it's so common that everyone believes it's true. If you didn't believe that and believe that it couldn't be proven true, then you would not find this enthymeme logically sound and valid, okay? Generally, the speaker will only admit a major or minor premise if they can assume that it's already accepted by the evidence. So ask yourself, what is the major or minor premise and what's being left out? Do I accept what's being left out? Or has the author been hasty in the assumption that they're making that I will believe the premise that they've left out? Okay? He couldn't have stolen the jewelry. I know him. The major premise is he couldn't have stolen the jewelry. That's the argument that's being made. And the minor premise is I know his character. Right? Major premise, he couldn't have stolen the jewelry. The minor premise, I know his character. The unstated assumption is that, of course, his character is outstanding, is honorable, right? That doesn't have to be stated. No, if you knew this person as well and you didn't believe that, you knew his character to be otherwise, then you would not believe that this claim was substantiated. Okay. Syllogisms. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which syllogisms can go wrong. Some syllogisms contain false presumptions. When you start assuming one of the major or minor premises to be true, even though they're not based in fact, as with the disjunctive syllogism and an enthymeme, you run the risk of making a false presumption. I know that all of America has been arguing about this election, and so you probably had so many different opportunities to kind of break down someone's argument, right? Concerning major issues in this election. So we're going to look at syllogistic fallacy, how syllogisms can go wrong. All crows are black. The bird in my cage is black. Therefore, the bird is a crow. The unstated minor premise that would need to be included, the evidence, we need further evidence, a second minor premise, if you will, that crows are not the only black birds, of course. And this is a silly, obvious example, but you can see how hasty assumptions can be made and syllogisms can go wrong. All crows are black. The bird in my cage is black. Therefore, the bird is a crow. My major premise is that all crows are black. That checks out. Minor premise, the bird in my cage is black. That checks out. Conclusion, the bird is a crow. That does not check out. There are many more different kinds of black birds. So A plus B, major plus minor premise, does not equal the conclusion, your major claim, because this syllogism contains false presumptions, incomplete information. It fails to account for the fact that there are other black birds besides crows. Okay, ravens, many others. All right? The scenery in Ireland is beautiful. I'm in Ireland. Therefore, the scenery must be beautiful. The scenery in Ireland is beautiful is a major claim. The evidence is I am in Ireland. The minor premise, and A plus B, major plus minor premise, should equal the scenery is beautiful. Aside from the fact that this is subjective, which is a problem, A plus B does not equal C here. Of course, not every black bird is a crow, and not all of Ireland is beautiful. When preparing a speech or writing a paper, you must always make sure that you're not making sweeping generalizations that will cause people to make false presumptions. All right? Or that you're not making false presumptions yourself. Rules of syllogism. There are 6 known rules of syllogisms, okay? Mainly they apply to categorical syllogisms. Since that is the only category that requires you have major, minor premises and a conclusion. Here are the 6 rules. There must be 3 terms, major, minor, premise, and conclusion. No more, no less. Rule 2, the minor premise must be distributed in at least one other premise. Rule 3, the terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the relevant premise. Rule 4, do not use 2 negative premises. They'll cancel each other out. If one of the 2 premises are negative, the conclusion must be negative. And Rule 6, from 2 universal premises, no conclusion can be drawn because the 2 premises are too general. Okay, so we're going to leave syllogisms for a bit and turn to assumptions, okay? All arguments require assumptions. We spoke a little bit about them when we were talking about the fact that a warrant includes unstated assumptions that you, as the author of your own argument, believe the audience will buy into, accept. An assumption is a point that the author does not even try to prove, because they're assuming that you already believe it, that it's already been proven. There's no need to provide further evidence for it, right? Rather than proving the assumption, the author simply assumes it's true and assumes that the audience will accept it. An assumption is not a point that the author tries to prove and fails at proving. It is a point that they do not even try to prove. Okay? There are 2 ways that an assumption is like a thesis statement. An assumption can be proved and can be disproved. An assumption can be expressed as a complete declarative sentence, not a question, not a word, or a fragment. It can be expressed in a complete declarative sentence. And a declarative sentence, remember, is when you are declaring something as fact, not a question, not a fragment, not an imperative that orders someone to do something, but a declarative sentence declaring a fact. There are 2 ways that assumption is not like a thesis. This will help you determine that this is not a thesis. The author never tries to prove an assumption, whereas the author always has to try to prove a thesis. The thesis is what the paper is aiming at, and the assumption is where the paper begins, where the argument begins from. It's all based upon an assumption that the author believes the audience will hold as true. Okay? The assumption on which the argument depends is also sometimes called a premise. All men are mortal. This is an example of another syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates must be mortal. The first two statements are premises. A major premise, all men are mortal. And a minor premise, Socrates is a man. Evidence warrant, or evidence grounds. They are assumption because no attempt is made to prove them. We just assume that they are true. But the third statement depends on the truth of the major and minor premise. If either of them was false, the third statement would be false or unproven. All arguments require assumptions because they are an attempt to prove something. They are not bad. I have to clarify this here. Assumptions are not bad. We all make them just to operate and navigate our world. We all have to, because we are almost in no situation do we have all the relevant information we need to not have to make some sort of assumption, right? We're always dealing with incomplete information. Okay? We just assume they are true, and this could be from our education, from our cultural background, from any of those influences in our lives, right? All arguments are attempts to prove. Assumptions are not bad. They are essential to arguments. If you tried to prove every point, you would never finish, because every proof would depend on other points, which would also have to be proved, and so on to infinity. So assumptions allow us to kind of start on some common ground. Something that we know is already true. But you also have to be careful with them, because you can make presumptions, which are false. All right? You have to make sure that they're valid and that your audience is likely to share the assumptions that you make to be effective, okay? Think about proving a thesis. Begin with the thesis, which is the point we want to prove. And then you would list, of course, all the points you need to make to prove that thesis. We'll go on and on unless you, at some point, understand that no further proof is needed, okay? So the trick is knowing where to stop and which kinds of assumptions you can safely make. So there are two types of assumptions, which are explicit and implicit. When you identify someone's assumptions, and you always want to be identifying. Now, we talked about earlier, I'm always going to ask what kind of assumptions is the author making about their audience, but the author can be making other assumptions about other things, not just the audience, right? The audience's values and beliefs. So we always want to be thinking about what kind of assumptions the author is making in their argument, and of the audience, and of the audience's values and beliefs, okay? An explicit premise is just explicitly stated. The author states it, but of course makes no attempt to prove it, because no proof is needed, because it's obvious. It's obvious that we will all accept it to the author. The author believes this. An implicit premise in the article is unstated. It's never, the author never even feels the need to state it, much less spend time proving it, because it is a value or belief or idea that he or she believes the audience will accept, because it's so generally accepted. It's a safe assumption to make. Assumptions need to be rational and reasonable. And they're not necessarily errors or bad, because they're a necessary part of any argument. Some assumptions deal with facts. Other assumptions are analytical. So some assumptions deal with facts, straightforward factual information, and that assumption has to do with how those facts are interpreted. And the author is assuming that you will interpret those facts in the same way, as meaning and proving the same thing, okay? Other assumptions are analytical. They're based on facts, but they go a step further in making a sort of statement about those facts, interpreting them, analyzing them, explaining them, judging, ranking, or weighing them. Okay? So, still other assumptions deal with values. Unlike factual and analytical assumptions that can be defended with evidence and reason, it's impossible to prove assumptions made about values and beliefs. They often have to do with what the author believes is good or desirable or moral. Okay, and it's almost impossible to prove that. Identifying and evaluating and revising your own assumptions is important. We want to know what assumptions we're making in our daily lives and be ready to revise when we get new information. Like the articles you read and analyze for this class in your textbook, you make certain assumptions every day when you are trying to prove a point to a friend or when you come to a conclusion about ideas that you have or ideas that you're presented with. Often we're not aware of these assumptions that we're making because they seem so obvious and so inherently true, but they might not be. So you have to step back and examine these assumptions, right? And sometimes we make bad assumptions without really realizing it. One important part of persuasive writing, and this is why I'm asking you to examine the author's assumptions, because it will help you to examine your own. Why am I accepting this author's assumption, or why don't I accept this author's assumption? What assumptions am I making when I'm writing my own argument? So examining others' assumptions will help you to examine your own, to make sure that they're valid and consistent with the argument that you're making and with the information that you have. And we have to revise them when we're mistaken. You can analyze your own assumptions in the same way that you analyze others when you do your reading. Going through the main points and spotting the claims that you make or the claims that you imply and those that you do not try to prove. So along with your outline, when you're making an argument, you've written down your main claims and your supporting evidence. You want to write down the assumptions, identify and write down the assumptions that you're making that are implied in your argument, okay? You want to be able to recognize those. It's a really great skill and important in order to make a very strong argument, okay? What have you not tried to prove? What are you assuming the audience will believe and not question and not be critical of? What assumptions are you making about what is generally good? Okay. Once you have identified your assumptions, you'll want to have some strategies for dealing with them and revising them. Okay. And I'll go over that next week, how to look at revising your assumptions. All right. I want to spend just a few moments going over thesis statements again. I ended the last lecture talking about how specifically to write a thesis statement with in a rhetorical analysis. I ended the last lecture explaining how to write a thesis statement for your rhetorical analysis specifically, which is different than any other kind of thesis statement. But I want to more generally just remind you, speak really specifically about the jobs that a thesis statement has to do. A thesis statement has quite a bit of things to do. So before you write a thesis statement, of course, you want to really examine and analyze your primary sources before coming to a conclusion, right? Because your thesis statement will contain that conclusion. You all know that, right? So analyze your primary sources that you're looking at. Then, of course, you want your thesis to be in your introduction so your audience knows right away what you're arguing. Your thesis needs to anticipate the counter-argument. I've talked a bit about that today. Once you have a working thesis, you should think about the argument that could be made against it and anticipate it briefly in your thesis statement. You also want to think about the arguments that you'll need later on to refute the counterargument in your essay and briefly address them in your thesis statement, okay? What a thesis statement is not. It's not a list. For example, for political, economic, social, and cultural reasons, communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. It does a good job of telegraphing to the reader what to expect in the essay. A section about political reasons, a section about economic reasons, a section about social reasons, and a section about cultural reasons. However, political, economic, social, and cultural reasons are pretty much the only possible reasons why communism could collapse. There are no other reasons why it might collapse. So this sentence lacks tension and doesn't advance an argument. In other words, it's not arguable. So I want to back up a step. The number one rule in writing a thesis statement is it needs to be arguable. Okay, it needs to be arguable. For that reason, it's never a list, all right? It's never a question. It's an answer to a question, all right? You've got a research question that you're writing about. Your thesis statement is the answer to that research question, okay? It should never be vague, combative, or confrontational. I don't want to say never here because there are times that I could think of when the type of argument you're making, it might benefit you to use combative or confrontational language because it's rhetorically a good move. I can't say that those cases are common. Most often it's really bad to use confrontational language because your audience is already, you're already hostile with your audience, and your audience is already not well disposed to listen to what you have to say after that, okay? It's like when you're talking to someone and you just get right up in their face. Nobody likes that. No one wants to listen to you. They automatically shut down and want you to go away. So combative language is the same thing. However, I can't say that it would never be rhetorically effective to use that kind of language. Never. But most often you want to avoid that, okay? It definitely should never be vague. It should be specific. An effective thesis has a definable, arguable claim. It needs to be arguable. There has to be someone who might disagree with you. All right. I use the example of a friend of mine who was in grad school, and she said, for my thesis, I want to write my thesis. I would cover how Shakespeare influenced all other forms of popular culture. And I told her, right, but no one would disagree with you. There's no tension. There's no argument there. It's clear that Shakespeare influenced movies, music, and all other forms of pop culture. No one would argue with you, and you'd have plenty of evidence, but you would not have, the problem would be, why argue it? Why spend this time coming up with all this evidence when there's no need to argue it and no one would disagree with you, okay? All right. So for that reason, also, of course, as you know, thesis statements should be as clear and specific as possible so that your audience really understands what you're arguing. All right. Needs to make an argument about the conclusions that you have reached during your research. It needs to make a promise. This I haven't brought up yet. It needs to make a promise to your reader about the scope of your argument and about your purpose for making this argument, and about the direction that your argument will take, okay? So how broad your argument is, the scope of your argument, your purpose for making this argument, and the direction that your argument is going to take. You don't want to make a left turn out of nowhere, right? You want your audience to know, I'm going down this road, I'm going to make a right here, I'm going to make a left here, and then make another right, right? So your thesis statement makes a promise to your reader about the scope of your argument, the direction of your argument, and your purpose for making this specific argument. Is specific and focused enough to be proven within the boundaries of your paper, a 3, 4, 5-page, 10-page paper. It's in the introduction, of course. And this is very important as well. It identifies the relationships between the pieces of evidence that you're using to support your argument and your main argument. It identifies the relationship between the pieces of evidence that you're going to use to support your main argument and how they relate to your main argument and how they relate to each other, how the pieces of evidence that you've compiled relate to each other, how they work together to support your idea, your argument, okay? All right. So just a few basic reminders about thesis statements, continuing from where we left off last class period, last virtual lecture. I hope you all had a great Halloween. Have a wonderful, happy election day. I know that this election is causing a lot of us, most of us, a lot of anxiety, and it's been really a chaotic time. So I hope that you have a great election day. If you're interested in watching the election results, I encourage you to do so. If you haven't already voted, again, go out and vote. And I will see you all next week. And I'm still trying to get your grades to you, so I'll be working on that. I'm falling a little bit behind on grading, but I'll be working on that. So expect the grades from your first close reading essay soon. Okay? I'll see you all next week.